Well, today we are continuing our sermon series where we are looking at what it is that makes Christianity distinctive, what makes it different to other religions. And in the first sermon in this series, Jeremy spoke about how Jesus was God in human flesh. He was 100% God and 100% human. It was an absolutely brilliant sermon. If you haven't heard it, it's still available to watch on our St. Matthew's YouTube channel. And as I begin, it might be helpful to explain the background to this sermon series. I guess many of you will have heard people say over the years, all faiths are like different paths up the same mountain. I don't believe that's true. I don't think Jews believe it's true. I don't think Muslims believe it's true. I don't think many faiths believe that is actually true. And for some people, saying that kind of thing can be an excuse for not actually doing any real thinking or consideration of different faiths. This sermon series is addressing exactly that issue. It reminds me of the old joke. A Christian, a Muslim, and a Hindu walk into a bar. Ouch, they should have been looking where they were going. Now, Christianity is different to other religions. And the resurrection of Jesus is clearly unique to the Christian religion. And today's Bible illustration readings illustrate why that is the case. Now, you may be wondering, why have we had readings from Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, rather than, say, a resurrection account from one of the Gospels? After all, the Gospels are like the biographies of Jesus. But the thing is this, the Gospels only started to get written down when it was realized that the disciples were dying out. They were written to pass on the information from the eyewitnesses. That was the primary purpose of the Gospels. In fact, John and Luke say exactly that thing in the Gospels themselves. Paul, on the other hand, was a theologian writing to people explaining the Gospel. And he's writing here a letter to the Corinthian church. And it wasn't in the category of the Gospels. This was a letter, not a biography. And it was almost certainly written 10 years before the Gospels were written down. This is one of the earliest pieces of New Testament scripture that we've got, probably only 20 to 25 years after the resurrection. Now, to put that in context, that is the same distance in time as we are away from the millennium, the year 2000. I wonder how many of you remember the celebrations for the year 2000. I'm guessing quite a few of you. That, of course, was a year when we celebrated the 2000th anniversary of Jesus' birth. But for many of us here, the year 2000 seems like it was only yesterday. It's easy to remember. For me, I remember it because it was a year I finished teaching and I started training for ordination. Feels like it was only yesterday. So this letter from Paul was written when many of the disciples were still alive. And we heard that in the first reading. If what Paul wrote wasn't true, the disciples and the others could contradict it. But they didn't. In fact, the later biographies, or the Gospels, supported what Paul said. So today, I'm considering the resurrection of Jesus. This is a unique, central foundation of Christianity. And this distinguishes Christianity from other faiths. Now, if you've heard me on the Alpha course before, you will have heard me speak at great length about the evidence of the resurrection. And that it's the only logical explanation is for it to be true. The resurrection really happened. So I'm not going to cover that today, as it's not part of the main focus for the talk. But if you have never considered that the resurrection actually happened, let me say there is a lot of evidence for it. There are whole books that have been written about it, loads and loads of books. One of the best books I've got is this one called The Case for Christ. Got a copy of it here. This is by Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was a journalist and an atheist. He didn't believe. And he decided to examine the evidence by talking to leading experts in different fields. That was Lee's journey to deciding actually it's true. For me, Having considered the evidence, I really don't understand how intelligent people can come to any other logical conclusion. I just don't understand it. I'd love to hear someone try to give a convincing argument that Jesus wasn't resurrected. When you consider the evidence, it doesn't make sense. But I'll sum it up using a quote I saw on Facebook again just a few weeks ago. Many of you may not know who Charles Colson is. Charles Colson is the guy on the right there. He was also known as Chuck Colson. If you don't know him, let's just say he was one of the leading people in the Watergate scandal. That was the biggest scandal to hit the White House in America in the last century. Something that led to a president being forced to resign and a constitutional crisis. And you can see the president on the left there. I'm sure some of you will recognize which president that is. But Charles Colson was intimately involved in it. And he ended up serving time in prison because of his part in the Watergate scandal. And when he came out, he wrote this a number of years later. I know the resurrection is a fact. And Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus had raised from the dead. Then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it wasn't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me the 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. The first followers of Jesus couldn't keep the good news of the resurrection to themselves, and neither should we. So let's move on to consider why is the resurrection of Jesus so important. Now, our second Bible reading, Paul talks a great deal about foolishness and wisdom. Stupidity, foolishness, whatever you want to call it. There's an awful lot of it about in the world. Reminds me of the story of the young man who decided to start up a chicken farm. So he buys 100 chickens to get up and running. A month later, he returns to the dealer to get another 100 chickens because the first lot have all died. Another month passes, and he goes back to the dealer for another 100 chickens. The young farmer says, I think I know where I'm going wrong. He tells the dealer, I'm planting the chickens upside down. Foolishness. You know, many people think they know what the message of Christianity is about, including the resurrection. But when you think about it, it is a pretty incredible claim. It's one that the Jewish leaders, the Jewish faith, really struggled to believe. The early church went and told the claim to the known world, including other religions like the Greeks, and they struggled to believe it. It's one that today many people struggle to believe. Why is that? Why is the resurrection of Jesus so important? Well, I think it's partly answered in our reading. And Paul does this by talking about wisdom and foolishness. And there are 3 points I want to make with 3 different headings. Firstly, this world's wisdom is foolishness. Secondly, Paul goes on to say, God's wisdom appears to humans as foolishness. And then thirdly, the short bit, my conclusion will be, what is the result of God's wisdom? But before I get to that bit, let me start off with verse 18 from our second reading to set the scene. And it explains God's plan. It says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is a power of God. So how is it God's power to save people? Well, basically, the message of the cross, in a nutshell, is this. On the cross, God himself, in the form of Jesus, demonstrated how much he loved humanity, and he paid a debt. He paid the penalty for every single thing I have ever done that is wrong. All my sin, all my shame. And he also, every single thing that I will ever do that is wrong. Because if you notice in that verse, it talks about the phrase being saved. It's an ongoing dimension. But because of that saving work, I can have a relationship with God as humans were originally designed to have. And that isn't just true for me. That is true for every single person who chooses to accept the offer from God. If you like, that links back to last week's All Together service. God's action inviting our response. The message of the cross is God's foolish plan. And it's a constant message of love from God as he reaches out to the world. So the next verse in that reading, verse 19, is a quote from the Old Testament. And Paul uses it to make a specific point. It's from Isaiah, and it says this: I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. So in other words, this message, this foolish plan, is for all people. You don't have to be a brain box. You don't have to be more intelligent than the winners of Mastermind or even The Chase. You don't have to have a degree in theology or be a vicar or be a bishop. You don't have to be having amazing spiritual experiences. You don't have to be from a specific race or ethnicity to understand and have access to God. This is not for an elite group that have some special understanding. There is no elitism in Christianity, or at least there shouldn't be. All people are equally valued, equally important, and have equal access to God. And that means each and every one of you. All people. So let's go on to that first point about God's foolishness. The world's foolishness is wisdom. The world's wisdom is foolishness. The Bible reading said, where is the wise person? Where is a teacher of the law? Where is a philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? And the ideas behind this are actually quite simple, although it's written in quite a confusing way. If God has destroyed the wisdom of the wise, well, that leaves only God's stuff left. If God has destroyed the wisdom of the wise, where does that leave the well-known thinkers and influencers and philosophers of our time? You know, people like Richard Dawkins, or Sandy Toksvig, or David Attenborough, or Mark Zuckerberg, or Elon Musk, or even Donald Trump. Where does that leave the law experts and the bureaucrats? Like those who say prayers can't be said in council meetings, or the ones who make you fill in a 24-page form to justify carer's allowance for someone who's in a care home. And yes, that one is personal. Where does this leave the great debaters and the leaders of this age? You know, people like Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer. Paul is saying, if God has destroyed the wisdom of the wise, that means that God's wisdom is all that's left. And that means we need to consider Jesus' death on the cross, which is God's foolish plan. That means we need to consider it. And of course, to many people, both then and now, that appears really foolish. They would rather follow this world's wisdom. So what does this world's wisdom look like? Just 3 examples. But we have, in today's world, a number of very popular beliefs. Beliefs that are trotted out by parents and politicians and pop stars and other influential people. You know the kind of thing I mean. If you watch TV or look at the internet, you will hear these things all the time. They get trotted out because, another trotted out so often, people begin to believe them. Look after number 1. If I want something hard enough, I can achieve it. I can achieve anything. The more money you have, the happier you'll be. Well, let's just look at some of those examples of our world's wisdom. Those, I guess, are just some of the popular beliefs we hear regularly in our society. But if we even think about them a little bit, it's obvious that they fall short. And they aren't actually very wise. So if we look after number 1, we put ourselves before others. We start to engage with other people depending on what we can get out of it. The thing is, other people will soon realize that. And they start withdrawing from us because they see us as self-centered. We can end up focusing so much on ourselves that we are in danger of leading a very lonely life. I mean, look where this focus on number 1 has got to us in this country. Loneliness is on the increase. Last year, an NHS survey found that 1 in 5 adults, over 1 in 5 adults, reported feeling lonely. Nearly 1 in 4. That rose to nearly 1 in 3 in the 16 to 24 age category. Loneliness is a pandemic we're suffering from. That's one reason why St Matthew's Church wanted to start a community choir, which Andrew leads, and we're very grateful for that. But it helps battle against loneliness and isolation and mental health issues, because a choir involves doing something together. You can't very easily be selfish in a choir. And when you do something together, like making a good sound, you feel better. That's why bell ringing is so good for your health, both physical and mental health. Or how about the second idea here? If you want something hard enough, you can achieve it. Now, if you ask my family, they will tell you, if anything gets me shouting at the television screen, it's when people say this. It's just not true. Sometimes it doesn't matter how hard you try, you won't reach your dreams. Common sense tells us that. Some of you will probably know my son was an international gymnast. His dream was to go to the Olympic Games. That's what he wanted. He trained for years and years like that as a professional gymnast. And common sense tells us, though, that that is actually not very likely. And it didn't matter how hard he tried. And he went on to represent this country. But he couldn't achieve the thing that he really wanted. In every sport in the Olympics, there are a number of different competitors. They are all, or a number of them, are genuine medal contenders. I don't believe the person who comes second or third wants it any less than the person who wins the gold medal. Just wanting something or just working really hard for it doesn't mean you will get it. You've got a better chance of getting it, but it doesn't guarantee it. You watch The X Factor, you'll see exactly what I mean. Another piece of secular wisdom is this. The more money you have, the happier you'll be. No, I don't think so. Yes, there is a basic level of finance that allows you to have the basics of life. But actually, we all know that money doesn't lead to any depth of happiness. The kind of happiness that comes about from having money is only fleeting, and it so easily crumbles. Some of you may have heard of the sad story of the baker who lived not that far away from here, called Keith Goff. In 2005, he won £9 million on the lottery. He spent his winnings on racehorses and fast cars, and even an executive box at Aston Villa. That's how frivolous he was. But just 2 years later, after his big win, he split up with his wife after 25 years of marriage. He began drinking heavily. In 2009, just 4 years later, he told reporters, "My life was brilliant, but the lottery has ruined everything. What's the point of having money when it sends you to bed crying?" He died penniless and alone in 2010, 5 years after winning all the money he could want. The wisdom of the world says the more money you have, the happier you'll be in life. But it's a lie. We know money doesn't make you happy. Other things are far more important. Things like relationships, for example. And you see, the trouble with all those examples of human wisdom is that they tend to be inward looking. Human wisdom focuses on ourselves. It brings temporary satisfaction, but without considering the bigger picture. And I think it is very fair of Paul to write, this world's wisdom is foolishness. So let's move on to God's apparent wisdom. And it appears to humans as foolishness. This is verse 21 if you're looking at the Bible. See, Jesus was born in poverty as a member of a despised race. His mother was unmarried. When he grew up, he was a challenge to the religious people of the day, the ones who you might have thought God would want to spread his message. Jesus let himself be crucified on a cross. Yet if he was God, he could have so easily have stopped the suffering. How can that be wisdom? You see, God's wisdom focuses on the crucified Christ. And we're told in verse 23, the message is a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Other translations put it like this. They phrase it more strongly. Offensive to the Jews. Nonsense to the Greeks. So what is this unique aspect of Christianity? Well, one reason why this message of Christ crucified is offensive to the Jewish faith is because of a verse in the Old Testament. According to Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, someone who is hung on a tree, crucified on wood in effect, is cursed by God. And despite all the prophecies in Isaiah, the Jewish faith would never see a suffering Messiah in this way. Crucifixion of a Messiah figure would be massively offensive to them, because a Jewish expectation had built and built and built and built as they waited for the Messiah. They believed the Messiah would arrive with a great show. He would restore the glory of the nation, making them world leaders once again, acting powerfully on their behalf. Jesus was not the kind of Messiah the Jews were looking for. They weren't expecting someone who was humble and meek and spoke of the importance of servanthood. Jesus must really have confused them. And we know that the Jews demanded miraculous signs from Jesus in order to prove his claims. And actually, we still come across that attitude today. You may have heard it. You know, someone has said to me many times, different people have said to me, if only God would do an amazing miracle in my life, I'd believe in him. But God doesn't do miracles to order. If that would be the case, we would have power over him. And let's be honest, people still see miracles, and you reject God and his kingdom. Many of the Jewish leaders saw miracles that Jesus did. What was their response? They accused him of being in league with the devil. And after his resurrection, they denied he'd risen from the dead. They even tried to cover it up. The Jews wanted physical proof of Jesus. For the Gentile faith, or the Greek faith, it was more of an intellectual kind of thing. You see, the Greeks were known for their philosophers and their love of clever arguments. Watching people debate completely pointless arguments, that was like a spectator sport for them. We've actually got something very similar today. We call it social media. Christianity, with its blunt and simple message, contradicts the Greek culture. For them, and for some people today, knowledge is the main thing. Everything should be able to be understood. There should be no gap or mysteries that we can't solve. And that is a stance a lot of people have today. They assume science has disproved religion. But is that actually true? Well, actually, even some well-known atheists don't think science has got all the answers. In 2012, a guy called Brian Appleyard, he was a well-known atheist, said this when he was criticizing some of the other atheists. He said, one of the striking things revealed by the progress of science has been the revelation of how little we know and how easily what we do know can be overthrown. In other words, the more science we know, the more we realize how much we don't know. Knowledge is not everything. I always have sympathy for the child who came home from his first day at school, and his mother asked him, well, what did you learn today? The child replied, not enough. They want me to go back again tomorrow. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't use our brains. Of course we should use our brains. God gave us our brains. But knowledge is not everything. But the Greek mindset of the day, they would never have been able to understand that. Another reason why it's nonsense to the Greeks is this. The idea of a God who suffered, that went completely against the understanding of gods for the Greeks. A God who suffered would be a contradiction in terms for them. In the Greek way of thinking, the first characteristic of God was something called apatheia. That's the same word where we get the word apathy from, but it means an awful lot more than that. It means a total inability to feel anything. For them, if God can feel joy or grief or sorrow or anger, that makes him more human, not like a God. And the fact that God became human and suffered, that was a nonsense, foolishness to them. They couldn't conceive of the idea of the Word made flesh and dwelling amongst us. So Paul is talking about a message that is both offensive to the Jews and nonsense to the Greeks. But here is a really strange thing. Christianity was birthed in the Jewish religion. It existed in a world dominated by the Greek way of thinking. How on earth could Christianity grow or even survive in that kind of environment? And yet, amazingly, it did and still does. The kind of wisdom which centers on a crucified Christ could only be God's wisdom. And God's wisdom may appear as foolish to humans, but put simply, without God's wisdom, the world would never have been reconciled to God. We would all still be separated, lost in our sin and our shame. Hope would only be temporary, not eternal. And that leads to my final point of the day, which is the conclusion and very short. Verse 30. What is the result of all of this? The answer is new hope. New hope. Basically, it is impossible to know God by means of our own wisdom. God chooses to reveal himself to us. If we could know God through our own wisdom, well, we're putting ourselves equal to God. Why is the resurrection of Jesus so important? It's because, as we're told in verse 30, it is only through Christ, Jesus, that we can be put right with God. If we as humans could do what God has done for us, to bring ourselves back into a relationship with him, we would be equal with God. Either we would be God, or he would not be God. But when all is said and done, we can't pay the price for our sin and our shame and still live. We have to rely on Jesus paying the price if we want life, and life in all its fullness. Because the cross and resurrection puts an end to human self-sufficiency. We can't do it on our own. God's unique message of the cross and resurrection may be foolishness to the Greeks. It may be offensive to the Jews. It may even be offensive or foolish to people today. But it is a distinctive, unique power of salvation for all who believe. It's a unique power of salvation for all who believe. Amen.